Hey everyone, Tin Man here to discuss how I chose my main class and spec going into Shadowlands. Now there are a ton of classes and specs in World of Warcraft, so making a decision about which one to play as your main is no easy task. In this video, I'm going to go through my entire decision-making process, the different factors I considered, research I did, and hopefully that can give you a bit of an insight as to how I approach playing WoW, and maybe that'll help you to make a decision on what main you want to pick as well. So for me, the first question I had to answer was, what type of content do I want to focus on? This is important because defining the context in which you're going to be playing the game is critical to being able to make a meaningful decision. What you value in a class or spec will change based on whether you care more about raiding or PvP, maybe Mythic Plus dungeons, or even open world solo content, or things like achievement hunting and completionist type things. There's no right or wrong way to play WoW, it's all about whatever your personal goals are. For me, I knew that I wanted to be doing cutting-edge raiding and Mythic Plus content because that's what I have enjoyed most. I really like the competitive PvP, or PvE rather, at a very high level. And since I knew I wanted to be making video and stream content going into Shadowlands, I thought it would be a pretty good niche for me to focus on that kind of gameplay and strategy, and that's something that I think might be a little bit lacking from some other World of Warcraft content creators. And so I can carve out a little bit of a niche for myself there. So once I determine what type of content I'm interested in, the next question is, what is valuable in that type of content? And now here's where it gets a little bit tricky, because you're not going to be just playing a single type of content and only that. It's a big game, there's lots of different things, so you're going to have to make some compromises or some prioritization between your different goals. And since I'm interested in both raiding and dungeon content, there is going to be some overlap, but there's also some things that are valued in one context but not in the other, and then vice versa. So for my main choice, where these priorities are going to conflict, I'm going to be putting a slightly higher priority on raid progression over Mythic Plus dungeons, because my guild and I really want to be pushing for high raid ranking going into Shadowlands, and Mythic Plus is kind of a side goal for me as opposed to a high raid ranking. So one of the main differences is the value on ranged versus melee. Ranged DPS are generally very valuable in raids, since there are often a lot of mechanics that require you to move away from the boss or stand in specific places around the room, maybe swapping to adds that spawn far away from the boss, or any other number of mechanics that maybe punish melee characters and decrease their DPS or put them in higher danger of dying. In contrast, for dungeons like Mythic Plus, melee characters are not going to be punished nearly as hard, since trash and boss fights are contained to smaller areas. Melee don't really get forced away from enemies nearly as often, and in fact melee are often more valuable in dungeons since they have a shorter cooldown on their interrupts compared to most ranged specs, which is going to be very useful if you only have very few people available to interrupt enemy casts. The damage profiles are also different between raid and Mythic Plus dungeons. Raids often value high single target damage with occasional cleave and maybe some burst AoE when priority adds spawned. And in contrast, Mythic Plus dungeons are much more focused on consistent 3 to 5 target AoE for trash packs with occasional single target boss fights. And this can change a little bit each week based on whether the main affix is fortified or tyrannical, but in general, Mythic Plus puts a higher emphasis on AoE damage, and raids put a higher priority on single target damage. Now, in most cases, every spec can do their job at a basic level, right? All DPS can do pretty good damage, whether it's single target or a multi-target AoE. All healers can do reasonable healing, and at most levels of play, this is going to be good enough. You just do reasonable damage or reasonable healing, do the mechanics properly, and you're going to succeed just fine. But at the higher end of content, which is where I'm going to be pushing myself, like competitive Mythic raiding and Mythic Plus, your class utility really does start to become a more important factor. And by utility, I mean things like defensive abilities, CC effects, dispel effects, raid buffs. And you need to do more than just your baseline damage and healing. You really need to earn a spot by being better than an alternative that somebody could bring to that group. If every player can bring that reasonable DPS or HPS numbers, what sets your character apart from everyone else? Now that's the question you have to answer with choosing your main. Now, what utility you value, once again, depends on the type of content that you're going to be doing. In raids, the most important utility abilities are often going to be defensive abilities, especially immunities, since there will always be big damage events that defensive abilities will be useful for. Raid buffs as well, since every raid is going to need at least one class to bring the important buffs and debuffs, so there's almost always at least one raid spot for mages, warriors, priests, monks, paladins, and demon hunters. Raid-wide utility also includes some things like Warlock's Gateway, Shaman's Windrush Totem, and Druid's Stampeding Roar. While they're not quite buffs in the same sense as like pure damage or healing throughput, they're still very useful to your group for mobility purposes. And to a lesser extent, individual characters' mobility is important to avoid important raid mechanics, which generally have a pretty large effect or pretty large distance to travel compared to dungeon mechanics. But most classes generally have enough mobility for most mechanics in raids. For dungeons, in contrast, raid buffs are nice, but they're not quite as important since there are so many less people in the dungeon group to benefit from them. Mobility is also a little bit less of an issue since you have less space to cover in dungeons. Defensive abilities, though, are still very highly useful, especially at high key levels where certain unavoidable mechanics might just one-shot you without a defensive ability available. Your ability to interrupt, stun, or CC enemies also becomes much more important in dungeons compared to raids, since raids have so many more people to cover the enemies, and you generally just need a small amount of interrupts or CCs in raids. In dungeons, though, you typically will have a lot of enemies that need to be dealt with, but you only have 5 people who have abilities to deal with them. The last consideration, if you're doing group content, is, well, your group. If you play with a guild, then you have a pretty consistent group to raid or do dungeons with, and this will allow you to coordinate to make sure that all required roles and classes are filled for this type of content that you want to do. For instance, my guild made a simple sign-up type spreadsheet where everyone put in their planned main class and spec for Shadowlands. A lot of players in the guild wanted to swap classes from what they played in BFA, and some even wanted to swap roles. And this let us get all of the information in a common place so that everyone can see the state of the raiding roster. It also lets us know what classes or roles we were lacking and which ones were going to be very popular. So for instance, when we first filled this out, there were a lot of my guildies who wanted to play Warlock. So if I was thinking about playing a Warlock, I would probably move it down a little bit on my priority list because we already have a lot of them in my group. In contrast, initially we didn't have a single person interested in playing Mage, and that stood out to me in particular because mages obviously bring a very important raid buff in Arcane Intellect, and so I would definitely seriously consider Mage if it fits some of my other criterias. Of course, there's still lots of other things to consider, but when seeing what my guild needs or had too many of, that does play a little bit into my decision of what to main. If you do have a guild or are planning on finding one, then oftentimes it's going to be more beneficial to be playing as a DPS player rather than a healer or a tank. Simply put, there are a lot more DPS in raid than there are healers or tanks, and it's much more likely to find an open DPS spot in an established group than it is to find an open tank or healer spot. Those roles tend to have a lot less turnover, so DPS is in a more in-demand position for most organized groups. On the other hand, though, if most of the group content you plan to do is through the group finder or just pickup groups, then it's the exact opposite. Healers and especially tanks are in far higher demand for those type of groups, and you'll often be accepted to them much easier with lower eye levels or lower experience compared to DPS players, just because they are struggling to find tanks or healers for pug groups. So we talked a lot about what makes a class good or bad in different contexts, but probably the more important part, at least for most players playing WoW, is to remember that it is a game after all, and you really should be playing something that you enjoy. If you're not enjoying yourself while you're playing, then why are you really playing in the first place? So I tried out a bunch of different classes and specs to see what felt appealing to me, like the playstyle, the aesthetics, of the individual class, and just find out what I enjoyed playing and then see how that would fit into the context that I want to be playing it in. I tried to be as general as possible when evaluating the different classes rather than saying, oh, I like this one specific spec. I would try to figure out why I like that spec. What about its playstyle or what about its aesthetic or utility or gameplay did I enjoy? And that way it's a bit easier to find other similar specs that I might enjoy without putting a ton of time onto every single one of them to, go through the entire list. I can just kind of look and say, hey, this one plays similar to one that I already enjoyed. I'll probably like it too. So for me, I pretty quickly identified that I wanted to play a DPS. It's what I played in BFA, and it's a role that's in demand for organized groups like my guild, as mentioned before. And I just generally enjoy trying to push myself to do the top damage on every one of the raid fights. While there is always an optimal rotation to follow, I still feel like I'm kind of solving a puzzle every fight, trying to maximize my damage and execute the best strategy. I also love focusing on self-improvement, which, of course, every class can focus on self-improvement. You can always be playing better than you were, or you also be playing worse. But in the case of DPS, to me, playing better was pretty clear. You just deal more damage. For tanks and healers, it's a little bit more obscure whether you're doing well or poorly, since the result is a little bit binary. You either live or die as a tank, you either heal the incoming damage as a healer, or you don't and your group wipes. And there's kind of no in-between. It's you succeed or you fail. At least with DPS, I feel personally that you can always try to find a way to further optimize your damage output, which is just very appealing to me. But just knowing that I wanted to play DPS doesn't really narrow it down that much. There are a lot of DPS specs in World of Warcraft. In BFA, I rated as an Enhancement Shaman. That was a spec that I really enjoyed. It's just, I like the Shaman aesthetic. I liked hidden people with big powerful weapons and storm strikes. But I didn't really care too much about what was competitive or optimal. I just really liked the class. And while I still like the Shaman class fantasy and theme, I also found out that I really enjoyed killing tough raid bosses with my guild and pushing hard Mythic Plus dungeons. And to do that, I need to make sure that I'm playing a competitive class for those types of content. So I asked myself, what about Enhancement Shaman did I really enjoy? And after trying and leveling up a bunch of other specs and playing them at max level, I figured out that I really enjoyed the proc-based gameplay. I like having my buttons light up and say, hey, hit this button right now because it's empowered, because you get a strong effect. The empowered storm strikes, the storm strike chains really on old Enhancement Shaman was really impactful and strong and just felt good to me to play. Now, another melee class that has a lot of procs similar to that is the Frost Death Knight, which also revolves around managing resources and spending procs on Howling Blast and Obliterate. Now, both of these were melee specs that I really enjoyed, and I think the part about melee that was appealing to me in particular was the freedom of movement. I knew I could do my entire DPS rotation while constantly moving around the enemy to dodge mechanics, as long as I could stay in melee range. So I did make a note of that. I like that freedom of mobility, and I decided that if I did want to play a ranged class, I would try to find one that had a lot of mobility as well. It would be a pretty big shock, and I don't think I would enjoy it if I had to play a ranged class that really had to stand still like 100% of the time in order to deal their damage. So one class rather that I looked at was both the Fire and Frost mages. I thought felt fit into this category pretty well. They had a lot of instant cast abilities, and also hunters as well, especially Beastmaster hunters, who can deal 100% of their damage while moving. So those ranged classes also kind of appealed to me in terms of the mobility factor. Now, another broad style of DPS that I considered was the dot-based classes, specifically Shadow Priest and Affliction Warlock. Now, I did enjoy playing these classes a lot when they're in AoE situations with multiple targets, where I had to constantly keep my dots up on many enemies, juggling a lot of targets and timers to make sure they didn't expire and I could refresh them in time, while also still trying to cast the rest of my abilities. And this felt really fun and engaging and rewarding when I did it right. But on single target fights, those dot classes really fell short for me. They felt very simple to just kind of keep your dots all up on one target. There wasn't as much thinking, wasn't as much action on single target, and you just very quickly fell into just spamming your filler spells until your dots were about to fall off. And so I'm going to keep these classes as an option in the back of my mind, just based on how fun they are in multi-target situations, and if needed, I could then deal with them in single target situations as well, but they aren't going to be my top choices. So at this point, I have a list of attributes that I'm looking for in a main and a list of classes and specs that I'm interested in. So now we just need to compare them and see which one fits the best, and then bam, we'll have a main. So first up, the Enhancement Shaman, my BFA main. It did get reworked quite a bit, but I still really enjoy its new playstyle. It's got lots of procs, very fast paced, lots of cooldowns and resources to manage. But in terms of viability though, it is melee, which works against it for high-end raiding as discussed before. Even worse, it doesn't bring any utility that is unique to melee, other than the relatively weak Wind Fury totem. No raid-wide Battle Shout, or Monk, or Demon Hunter debuff, or anything like that. Just the Wind Rush totem for a speed boost, but that could also be brought by any other shaman like Resto or Elemental, who's a ranged DPS, not just a melee enhancement. It also has relatively weak defensive abilities, just Astral Shift as a defensive ability, and no other easy self-healing or immunities or anything else like that. Reincarnation is quite powerful, but it is not up consistently enough to really count here. You can't really plan on having Reincarnation at a set point in every fight. So that does leave Enhancement Shaman as one of the most vulnerable melee classes in the game. For Mythic Plus dungeons, though, Enhancement has pretty good stacked up AoE damage, and has a good bit of utility from the totems, as well as a very short cooldown interrupt, which can also be cast at range. So it is okay at Mythic Plus dungeons, but not very great for raids. Next up, the Frost DK, another melee and proc-heavy gameplay style that I did enjoy. It has much better defensive options compared to the Enhancement Shaman with Icebound Fortitude and Anti-Magic Shell, and also brings some more raid-wide utility like Anti-Magic Zone and Death Grip for stacking up enemies. It is a little bit slower than Shamans in terms of mobility, and it is still a melee class, so there would be a lot of running out of melee range to do mechanics and whatnot, so it was still a little bit iffy for me as a viable choice. As for the Frost and Fire mages, they are both ranged, which is a big plus for raiding. Both have high mobility compared to other classes with Blink as well as Shimmer or Ice Flows for Frost, and they have great defensive options including an immunity and Ice Block. And of course they also bring Arcane Intellect, which my guild was potentially lacking for our raiding roster. They also have strong stacked up AoE for Mythic Plus dungeons, but they do struggle a little bit if enemies are spread out, which is a little bit more likely to happen in raid than in dungeons. Overall though, Mage seems like a great option so far. Now, the Beast Mastery Hunter was pretty similar to mages for me in a lot of ways. Lots of mobility at ranged, good stacked up AoE and immunity, good defensives. But I decided against it because we already do have a fair few number of people in my guild wanting to play Hunter, who also played Hunter in BFA, so I figured we would probably have more than enough that one more Hunter was not going to be quite as useful. As for the dot specs, Shadow Priest and Affliction Warlock, both of them have decent ranged mobility thanks to their instant casts, but not quite as much as Hunters or Mages. They also lack a little bit in terms of defensives compared to Hunters and Mages, which puts them a touch below in terms of survivability in encounters. They do handle spread out enemies much better since they can apply their multi-dots on all kinds of different enemies no matter where they're standing, but that was not quite enough for me to put them over the top since they were already a touch below in terms of my enjoyment of the specs. Plus, a lot of other players in my guild were already interested in Affliction Warlock and Balance Druid, who could cover that niche of the spread, cleave, and raid, so I wouldn't feel terrible about not playing a class that, or playing a class that couldn't handle that very well. So it was pretty clear to me that Mage was going to be my top choice and will be my main in Shadowlands. I will probably dabble in some of the other classes and specs that were on this list while making video content here, probably in dungeons, maybe a little bit in raids as we finish progression and get the raid on farm. But for the start of Shadowlands, Mage is going to be what I mainly focus on because it really does check so many of those boxes and has a playstyle that I really enjoy. While I don't know if I'm going to be playing Fire or Frost as my main spec, or which Covenant or Legendary I will be using initially, a lot of that will come down to tuning, and Blizzard does seem intent on tuning right up until Shadowlands launch, and possibly even more once Shadowlands is released. Suffice to say though, I have been keeping a very close eye on the sims for mages, trying to answer the question of which spec, Covenant, and Legendary is going to be best and in what situation. Discussion of sims really deserves its own video, but suffice to say that there is a lot of math and programming going on by some very dedicated people. One of them, named Toe Grinder, put together this nice little site with a bunch of analysis on all three mage specs across all the different covenants, legendaries, number of enemies, and even which race your character is. Unfortunately, all of this information does change dramatically every time Blizzard makes any changes to one of these things, or even when somebody figures out a more optimal damage rotation or gear setup for the simulation. But as things stand here, shortly before Shadowlands release, it does appear as though Venthyr Frost Mage or Night Fae Fire Mage are going to be the frontrunners in terms of spec and Covenant choice. Now, all of that is subject to change, of course, but that is how it is currently looking, and those are the two that I'm most likely to pick going into Shadowlands on launch day. Well, that was a lot of information, and thank you for sticking with me through all of it. While a lot of the specifics that I mentioned were unique to me and my situation, I do hope that you can learn something from my experience and my thought process and apply it to your own situation. Maybe you like different types of content or have different preferences in the terms of the playstyle and aesthetics of the class, but if you follow the same type of decision-making structure, I bet you can find a main class that will fit your needs and one that you really enjoy. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I will see you next time.